This lesson we're connecting to the random user ME API. So this is an API with a lot of data. It's an open source API that's great for practicing and connecting to getting some data. And it's got a fairly complex object that gets returned back. So we're going to be practicing looping, getting the property values from the object, also getting the arrays so that we can loop through the array contents and then output the property values on the page using the AJAX request. So what this does is this makes a request, retrieves back 5 items from the endpoint, and then just populates them on the page. It's getting an ID value, an email, a name, and a picture. And then these are all just placeholder content. So this is all dummy content that's coming from the endpoint. We're going to be creating page elements, updating some styling on the page elements, and outputting it into the page. This lesson we're going to be connecting to the random user API. So this is a free open source API that generates random user data. So it's fake data that you can practice and connect to, and in order to get more familiar with making AJAX requests and getting the data from an endpoint, returning it into your web page. So here they've got some examples of how you can make the AJAX request as well as the results. It's coming back as JSON formatted data. So there's quite a bit of information that's contained in there, and then you can select that data and output it on your page. In order to make the connection, so this is an example of some of the data that's coming out. You can find out. So the endpoint URL is going to be the random user.me/API. And that returns back the content in a JSON formatted. You can also select the number of results that you want. So if you want 5 results, you can set the parameter as 5 and return back the different number of results back. So let's add in the URL, and then we can adjust the number of results. So if we want results for 5, and we can have a condition here that checks to C and set up the URL as let so that we can update the value of the URL. And we're checking to see if results is greater than 1. And if it is, then we're going to update the URL with the value of results. So let's take the URL and we're just going to be updating it. So the URL is going to be just that, and that's just going to return back the 1 result. So if it is larger than 1, then we're going to add to the URL the value of what we have for results. So update the URL, and let's output the URL. Actually, let's output the URL into the main for now. So while we're testing, so we can see the output as text content, and this is going to be returning back whatever the URL is. So there's our URL. If we have 1 item, then it's just going to get the 1. If we do 2, then the URL is going to have the results 2. So it's going to returning back the different values for the results. And we want to make the request when the button is clicked. So on the button, let's add an event listener. And the event that we're listening for is going to be the click. And we'll run a function called makeData, create the function. And this data is going to be making a request. So using fetch, making a request to the URL. Once we get a response back, then returning that response back. And this is going to be as JSON format. So now we can then use it as JSON. And then the next item is to return it back as data. And then we'll create another function called adder in order to add the data to the page. So create the function, adder, and adder is going to have 1 argument there called data. And for now, we're going to output the data into the console just to make sure that we've got the connection and that everything is established and that we've got content being returned back. So when we look at the response back, we've got 2 properties here. We've got info and results. Results is going to be the array of items. So the results is going to be what we want to loop through. I'll update this to 5. So within the results is where we want to loop through and get the content. So we don't need the info, we just need the results. So there's the 5 items. If we change this to 1 and we make the default connection, that's just going to give us the 1 item in the array. So just double checking and making sure that it's working the same and that the results that we're retrieving back are the same. As long as it's an array, then that means that we can loop through the array and output, extracting out the information. So using the for each, we're looping through, and this is each person. And we can output the object of the person into the page, comment out that console message. So that's each one of the people. And each one of these is also a complex object that has quite a bit of data that's contained within it. So you need to select out what you want to retrieve back, which data that you want to retrieve back. And so in this case, what we're going to do is we'll get the ID, we'll get the name, and then we'll also get the picture, and we'll output that onto the page. So first off, let's get the ID, and I'm going to just comment out the values that we want to get from the person. So we want to get the ID, and there's 2 properties within ID. So we've got a name and a value. So that's going to be a name and value. So let's get those items first. And as we loop through, we need to create a main container for it, as we're going to be adding these to the page. So I'm going to create a function that's going to create element. Create element. It's going to require some parameters. So the element type, we'll just get a variable of t. And these are all going to be appended to main. We can also append them to different parents. So we can have that as a parameter as well. So let's create the element using the document create element. And this will save us some coding, some repetition in the coding, where we can a lot easier add the elements to the page. And we want to return it back, appending it to the parent, and using the append child, returning back the element that was just appended. So that will give us a way to append that to the page. And we can also add in some content. So for the element, the inner HTML, we can just set as HTML. So now we've got a quick way to create page elements. So let's create that as the main holder. So using the create element function that we just created, we want to create a div. The parent is going to be main, and the contents of this are just going to be blank. So that will add that to the page when we create it. And then as we loop through, we want to get some of the content. So set up and create some additional elements. So this element will be the ID element using the create element method. Let's create a div. This is going to be attached to the holder. And the contents of this are going to be coming from the person. I'm going to simplify this and just use the key P for the property of the object within the loop for each loop. So we want to select out the person and the ID and the name. And so see how that looks when we output that onto the page. And then each one of these also has a value. So add that in as well to the output. So that's giving us the values and the names there. And it looks like one of them didn't have a value for there. So let's have a condition to see if the is no name is equal to null, or we can check to see if it's not equal to null, and then only then do we add it to the page. So let's save that And if we do have a null output there, so let's output this into the console. So it looks like we still need to update this condition as we're still getting some null values. So as we're outputting it into the console, if we have no value there, we should be just so we'll make sure that we do have a value for ID. So it looks like the ID is the one that's missing. So if it's not blank, then we want to output it onto the page. So sometimes you have to update the properties in order to make sure that you're getting them properly. So the reason that it was null is just it was blank. So we had no content to add into the page and was being retrieved back as blank. So within the object, the property ID was there, it existed. So that's why it was still outputting it on the page, but the value of name was just empty. Let's select some more items from the person, and we can also get the email address. That's another item that we can add to the page. So this is the email element, and using the create element method that we've been using, select the div, add it to holder, and then the contents of this are going to be a string value. And you can separate these out into separate variables if needed. So that's within the p email. I'll just structure it like that. So now we're going to be listing out the email of each one of these people. Also for the holder, let's update the style. And I'm going to add a border to it. So one pick, solid, and we'll make a really light border to it. And then also for that element, we can apply some padding to it. And you can do this with CSS as well as with JavaScript. So there's all the elements that we're creating. So the email addresses. I've got it zoomed in, so that's why it's rather large. But we can zoom back out so we can see all of the content on the same page. Let's also see what the next item is that we want to get. So we want to get their name. So let's create another element, and this is going to be the name. I'll just call it n element, and it's a div attached to holder. And this one's going to be a little bit more complex because this information is contained within p name, and then we've got first, last, and title. So contained within p name and first, so we've got the title, first, and then last. So selecting that object information, we click it. So we've got the names there being presented on the screen and the emails. And if they do have IDs, then those are added as well. We can also get the image. So we've got images there. So we've got a bunch of pictures. So we can add those as well to the page. And we want to maybe add them above the other elements. So this is where we can make the pic or thumbnail and create element. The element that we're going to be creating is going to be an image. This is going to be attached to the holder element, the main parent. And then for the image, it's got no content within it. So once we get the pic, we can update the source of the pic. And this is where we can set the value. So right now we'll just leave it as blank. And if we open up and look inside the elements, there's our container, there's our elements. So right now the source is unknown, email name. Going into the console where we've got an object property picture, and then we can select whatever picture, large, medium, or thumbnail that we want to use. So let's use the picture, and this is going to be contained within the main P object. So that's the person, picture, and large will be the path to it. So now when we click it, now we got some images there that are showing up for the people. Let's also update the holder style, and I'll set a width to this. So the width will be 150 pix, and the holder style display, let's set that to inline block. Have them stacked to the right. So if we add more, some more images. So no, it's overflowing. So we can also update the holder style overflow and just set that to be hidden. So there's no overlap outside of the main element. Although that's going to cut off some of the text. So again, depending on how you want to style it. And a lot of times this is going to be easier to style when you're using CSS. So this is just an example of how you can use JavaScript in order to make an AJAX request to an endpoint and then return back some data from that endpoint. So go ahead and try it out and get some of the different property values that are contained within the response object, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.